And we're going to start recording.
We are 1 minute to the hour of 7 p.m. Good evening, everyone. I am Reverend Sadiki Little Forbes. I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada, currently serving at the Sharon Hope United Church in Sharon, Ontario. I bring you greetings from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat nations. Nations who agreed to share the resources of the land with a dish with one spoon. Oh, you know what? The host has left the building.
I think you probably have the credentials to record. It's so you could just press record on your end.
I don't have record. I'm not a host. Record. Let me try this. Yeah, no, I don't have permission to record.
Why is it that you've called me here?
He didn't make me host.
How dare you speak to me that way?
All right. So, as I was saying, we are sitting on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat nations, and these nations agreed to share the resources of the land with a dish with one spoon, wampum covenant. We give thanks for their stewardship of the land, but we are also mindful that even as we live in peace on this land, there are broken covenants that need to be made right. A warm welcome to everyone who has joined us for this panel discussion today, as we reflect and highlight the significance of Emancipation Day by unpacking the myths and realities of Black enslavement and its legacies in Canada. Let us open in prayer until our technical team arrives. Creator of all that was, is, and to be, you declare all things good. Yet we confess that we struggle to keep all of your creation in this position. We are grateful for this gathering today and for all who have contributed to making it possible. As we gather to acknowledge the ways people of African descent have been removed from the position you gave to all, infuse our conversation with the truth of what has been done and show us the path to healing, forgiveness, reconciliation, and justice. Amen. This discussion will progress through three phases, moving from identifying the issues to proposing a path addressing these issues. You, our audience, will be invited as the conversation progresses to place your questions in the chat, and I will present as many as I can later. It's my privilege to introduce the panel that has joined us today. We have with us Dr. Deanne McCullum, and she is an history educator in the School of Education at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Jamaica. Deanne is also the practicum coordinator of the School of Education. She's a certified educator and human resource development trainer at the postgraduate diploma in history education at UWI. and she has a diploma in human resource development from the former Institute of the Management and Production, IMP. Dr. McCollum worships at the Saxthorpe Methodist Church, Western St. Andrew Circuit, Jamaica District, where she currently serves as a congregational steward and a Sunday school teacher. Also with us is Professor Ronaldo Walcott. He's a Canadian academic and writer. He wrote in 2021, I was born in the Caribbean, Barbados, and have lived most of my life in Canada, especially Toronto. Currently, Professor Walcott is an associate professor at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education and the director of the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. He's also affiliated with the Cinema Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Walcott was formerly an assistant professor at York University, and from 2002 to 2007, he was the Canada Research Chair for Social Justice and Cultural Studies. Walcott's work focuses on Black studies, Canadian studies, cultural studies, queer theory, gender studies, and diaspora studies. Our third panelist is Dr. Steed Davidson. He teaches Hebrew Bible at McCormick Seminary in Chicago. He serves as Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the faculty. His research interests cover post-colonial biblical studies and the ways biblical literature is used in the reproduction of empire and race. And last but not least, we have the Reverend Dr. Japheth, who has his PhD in practical theology from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. His first master's is in ecumenical theology from the University of Dublin in Ireland, and his second master's is in missiology from the University of South Africa. He did his undergraduate work in Zambia, his motherland. He's the executive minister of the Church in Mission Unit at the General Council of the United Church of Canada. He's an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada and has served in Newfoundland. He's also spent 5 years as General Secretary for the Council of Churches in Zambia and has worked with the All Africa Conference of Churches based in Nairobi, Kenya, as a senior executive staff. He's also served as the moderator of the Reformed Church in Zambia. And Japheth is happily married to Caroline, a wonderful Kenyan woman. And together they have and share 4 children and 1 daughter in love. We have quite a spectrum of experience for this conversation today, and I look forward to your insights, everyone. August 1 across the Commonwealth is celebrated as Emancipation Day, and it marks the actual day in 1834 that slavery was abolished, and it came into effect in 1884, though the act itself received assent in 1833. On March 24 of this year, the House of Commons voted unanimously to officially designate August the 1st Emancipation Day in Canada. And Canadians are invited to reflect, educate, and engage in the ongoing fight against discrimination against Black people and people of African descent. I wish to acknowledge Samuel Sharp, named among the national heroes and heroines in Jamaica, a Baptist minister who led the large-scale slave revolt on the Christmas holiday in 1831. I believe he sped up the legislation that led to the Abolition Act. Today, people of African descent live with the legacies of enslavement, and the starting point for healing is to name it. So I turn to the panelists. Many Canadians are aware that Black and Indigenous peoples were were unaware that Black and Indigenous peoples were once enslaved on the land that is now Canada. Share with us some of the myths and legacies of slavery globally and in Canada. I invite Dr. Diane McCollum to start.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel, and thank you so much for having me being a part of this panel, since I think I might be the only person who resides out of Canada, or he's not a Canadian. So it's good to share in what is a global phenomenon. So I start by saying that slavery is a universal phenomenon, but the myth, there is the myth that it was an institution that was started by the Western world. That is one myth. And the fact is that though we might be familiar, depending on our education, we might be familiar with slavery in the Americas and in the Caribbean. Slavery existed in Africa before the Europeans got there, and it also existed in Europe, in the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. It existed in the Islamic world, and it existed in the Mediterranean, it existed in Asia, it existed in China. So slavery is a universal phenomenon. What makes a difference is the type of slavery that, what it turned out to be when it became transatlantic, when Africans were taken across from Africa to the Caribbean. So it is not a Western phenomenon. That's my first point. In terms of the legacy of slavery globally, because slavery as a phenomenon turned Black, it has created a situation where, well, slavery and Black and race became united, when slavery as it existed earlier on was not necessarily racialized, nor was it linked to race, but it became linked to race when it took on the transatlantic proportion. And I just want to quote one historian who said that slavery, let me just find the point that he made. James Baldwin, he said that slavery linked the existence of color and race together in a way that slavery was not in prior to this. And he said it bequeathed a number of important myths about Blacks. So because it became linked with Blackness, it also left with us some myth about the Black person as inferior, the Black person as not possessing all of the criteria of humanity, and the Black person as not being as intellectually proficient as persons of other races, especially whites. So that is one of the legacy of slavery. It dehumanized Blacks. Now, with respect to Canada, the question is the myth and legacy about slavery in Canada. Now, Canada has a history that seeks to emphasize their role in acting as a haven for persons in the United States who are running away from enslavement. And so this aspect of Canadian history is part myth, because it is a part of their association with slavery that is emphasized. What is not emphasized is the fact that Canada had its own slavery. And whether or not the argument will be that slavery was not as inhumane, and it was not as extensive, and it was not as brutal, the fact is slavery as a concept has certain criteria. And once slavery, Black slavery existed in Canada, it existed. And so that has to be corrected in terms of how Canada's history is portrayed. That's it.
Thanks, Diane. So we have two myths to wrestle with. The one that slavery has originated in the West, and the one that Canada has to wrestle with, which is that it is not just the quote unquote salvation part. There is also the part that they actively participated in the institution of slavery itself. And then we have this legacy, which is the impact that bringing blacks into the transatlantic trade has had on the personhood of the black person and the perception of the black person. Thank you so much, Diane. Professor Walcott, what are your words for us today?
First, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me to participate in this important conversation on the first Emancipation Day that the Canadian nation state has finally decided that it would officially acknowledge. Of course, people in the Caribbean, where I was born and lived the first years of my life, have long commemorated, not celebrated, commemorated, and I make a difference between those two words. August 1st. In fact, this is the weekend that Barbados will traditionally have its carnival, which is a kind of marking of slaves and former slaves' rebellion against the brutalities of plantation slavery, sugar production, rum, molasses, and all that flowed from that deadly trade. And I say all of that because usually I live in the province of Ontario, but today I'm joining you from the island of Montreal, which is also the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples who moved across these territories and made these territories home. And, you know, I'm not very far away from McGill University, named after a former slaveholder who made significant profits from the trading rum and molasses and slaves, some bought from Jamaica, Barbados, into what was urban slavery in Canada in places that we now call Halifax, Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, and so on. And of course, outside of Montreal and just outside of Quebec City, there is the burial grounds referred to as the N-word Rock of Saint Armand that Black Montrealers and Black Quebecers have had to fight for preservation in terms of where former slaves have been buried, and the very, very, very long denial of the fact that Saint Armand, Quebec hosted that burial ground. I think it's significant and important that Canada has finally began to mark Emancipation Day and hopefully we can begin a conversation in Canada about Canada's long and sustained role in the evolution of a world that comes out of the unique circumstances of transatlantic slavery. I entirely agree with my colleague, Diane, that of course slavery existed, or forms of slavery existed in other places. But what unfolded in the post-Columbus period in terms of transatlantic slavery and the enslavement of African flesh is utterly unique in terms of other forms of slavery. Mm-hmm. And we should be really clear about that. Mm-hmm. And of course, on the east coast of Canada, in the Maritimes, in Nova Scotia, in Newfoundland, in New Brunswick, you know, the love of rum is something that characterizes those cultures. But if you talk to those people out there, they will tell you they know nothing of slavery. Well, the things that produce rum are not natural to that region. So rum arrived there via other processes. And we know that, you know, Canada's shipbuilding industry, before the cod was decimated, the salted cod, you know, So Canada's central role in transatlantic slavery, in the making of British Empire, is one that we are yet to reckon with in this place. And as I walk out of my hotel and I walk down the street here next to McGill University, all along Sherbrooke Street and other parts of Montreal, we see the detritus of Colonial, of the Colonial project. It's in the name of houses, it's in the architecture, it's in the name of streets. So this is an important moment, and one that I hope that we will be able to utilize, not only to educate, but to extend the long project of justice that Black people have been seeking since the Nina, the Santa Maria, and the Pinta sailed. So I look forward to further conversation with my colleagues here tonight. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Walcott. Reverend Dr. Davidson.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I begin my comments on this needed panel by contrasting two events in Caribbean history that both struggled, or perhaps still struggle, for appropriate recognition. So as we commemorate Emancipation Day today, this day resulted from the heightened struggle of a number of activists over the years. We can make a distinction between an officially sanctioned holiday and one that existed in the consciousness of people of African descent throughout the British Empire when it occurred. We must recall that this holiday in some parts of the Caribbean and maybe other parts of let's go with the Caribbean. The holiday replaced what was known or variously known somewhere along the lines of Discovery Day in several countries. And the sort of commemoration of Columbus's misadventures in the early part of the 20th century is not unlike the kind of a rise of trying to restore the legacy of Columbus that took place in other parts of North America, with holidays and inscriptions and statues and all of these kinds of things dedicated to Columbus. This happened in the Caribbean as well. And it seemed to have occurred as a means to dilute, by colonial authorities in the early 20th century, to dilute festivities hosted in several communities commemorating Emancipation Day. So the practice of joyous celebrations of the Emancipation date as far back as 1839 in some parts of the Caribbean, after a solemn observance took place on the very first day of emancipation in 1838, or depending upon which island you were in, it could have been earlier. Antigua, was an exception, because of course the date is problematic, because the British did this wonderful thing called apprenticeship, but we won't go into that right now.
Yes.
Now, not unlike the injustices embedded in the Act of Emancipation, the call for the official recognition of Emancipation Day reflects some of the narratives that I think we have to struggle with. For instance, in 1887, Nzumbo Lazare, formerly Emmanuel, his parents migrated from Martinique in response to the Spanish invitation to have a stronger and more robust population in Trinidad. He called upon the colonial authorities to declare August 1 a holiday. Now, this is 50 years later, right? So he argues, if patriotic subjects celebrate their queen's accession to the throne, then surely they should celebrate the landmark British humanitarianism, the abolition of slavery.
Wow.
Now, Lazare was unsuccessful, but his comments point in the direction in which Emancipation Day can easily slide. We can easily let Emancipation Day slide into these narratives of white generosity as this gift that was given because, well, white people suddenly got a conscience and decided to free the slaves. Of course, there may have been political reasons why he had to try to placate these white sensitivities. But the narrative, if we are not very careful, easily obscures the numerous evidences of resistance and rebellions to enslavement. And thank you, Diane, for putting the Samsha uprising on our radar today. But the suppression of this narrative has several impacts, among them overlooking numerous revolts, numerous uprisings, numerous attempts at protest, but more importantly, obscures the deep impact of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian example not only spurred further revolts throughout the hemisphere, right? And I'm talking about the hemisphere, North America included, and parts of South America, but it sent shockwaves across the world. Europe recognized the real threat to its business model. And of course, it acted accordingly to try to respond and to tamp it down. But Emancipation Day, in our imagination, should serve as the culmination, or one of the high points rather, in a long struggle to recover inherent freedom, a struggle for freedom that was waged ever since the first enslaved African landed in the hands of white people. The story of protest and revolt in service of African dignity should not be muted on days like these, particularly as it easily could slide into paying attention to white generosity. Therefore, setting Emancipation Day within the context of revolts like the Haitian Revolution or the Sam Sharp ones, or ones that we know or even are still discovering, extends the arc of our imagination, but it also extends the horizons of the possible actions that people of African descent will continue to take to sustain African dignity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davidson. I recall reading that the resistance, as you have said, ran for centuries. Even the Maroons had to be deported because of their misconduct in the lives of the plantation. And what the piece of history that I discovered when I moved to Canada was that the Maroons were sent to Canada first, to Nova Scotia, and then they went on to Sierra Leone. So the situation is such that there has been active resistance by our people to this. And for me, the watershed moment was that Sam Sharp rebellion that totally overthrew the Christmas holiday and helped the oppressors to recognize that we're not having this anymore. So thank you so much for acknowledging that. Reverend Dr. Jaffet, please join us.
Yes, just to continue that trajectory in terms of the resistance for dignity, the resistance for the struggle of the soul of the African people. It did not start when they were here. It started right from the ships when some of them opted to jump into the sea instead of risking their lives, instead of losing their liberty. They jumped into the sea. That's why that business became very difficult. And more of the ships that they made had to be now more complicated. They had to make sure that the slaves were kept in a basement where it was not possible for them to jump into the water. And of course, you know that from Ghana in West Africa, that unfortunately they were kept, and very sadly so. And this building where on top was a church, and underground were slaves before they moved out of the gate of no return. And when they started singing that song, "Over my head, there must be a God somewhere." Over my head, really literally over this place under the basement where we are, there are people there. Is there really a God somewhere who can come and help and rescue us? So the struggles really started way back, even before humans were trafficked and brought out. And that's why we read several stories of mutinies. We read even several stories of suicides. We read several stories of rebellion. And I mean, some of them, the Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, could be some of those popular stories of rebellion that the African people made. And so that aspect of the struggle needs to be underscored, that they did not just begin to struggle when they were here, but they began even from the moment they were captured. And so this system, yes, was in Canada, and that's a myth that needs to be disconstructed, because from about 1800 or so to about 1834 or so, close to 200 years. Close to 200 years, and especially that Canada survived on international trade, just as Rinaldo mentioned at the beginning, the trade that focused on salted cod. When I arrived in Canada, Newfoundland was my first province, and I was on the Burin Peninsula, and I discovered the people there still treasure salted cod. And until you know the stories from how this salted cod had to find its space in Canada. Issues around timber, rum and molasses and tobacco and sugar, all these as part of the international trade, which was supplied by slavery. Another myth I think we should not ignore to talk about is that people say, well, there must have been a silver lining somewhere to this forced bondage. There must have been a silver lining because ultimately some of the Black people found themselves living in these countries, so-called first world, developed world. And so there must have been a silver lining. I think it should be clearly indicated that they cannot be silver lining when humans are subjected and made dependent and are controlled, and that your entire liberty and freedom is taken away from you. You are controlled and made to be so dependent upon these other humans simply because of the skin color. These myths that the Blacks were so strong that they were made for forced labor, and therefore you could even do those medical exams and experiments on the Blacks without anesthesia because they are strong and they could resist. Those kind of myths definitely do need to be debunked. It was degrading, it was inhuman to have such kind of practices on fellow human beings simply because of their skin color. And so yes, emancipation to commemorate these practices that were done so that we might be able to re-energize ourselves and say no more as we face the future. And you are muted, Sadiki.
Thank you so much, panelists. So we've named the myths and we've highlighted some of the legacies. And we know that racism is systemic. When slavery was abolished, the sentiments towards Black people did not change with it. And these sentiments showed themselves in segregation policies and other forms of discrimination. For example, the last segregated school in Ontario closed in 1965, and the last segregated school in Canada closed in 1983 in Nova Scotia. In 2018, the Ontario Human Rights Commission found that Black people in Toronto were 20 times more likely to be shot dead by Toronto police compared to other races. Share with us, what are some of the realities for Black people today having to deal with the legacies of slavery? And I'll start with Professor Walcott.
Yes, thank you. That's a really important question. And the examples that you gave to open that question are even more important in some ways, because those examples pinpoint the still ongoing legacy of slavery by another name. That, you know, that Black people across North America and Europe are immediately and always susceptible to police violence of all kinds, from simple harassment to death at the hands of the police. It's a significant legacy of slavery. That within our education systems, that Black people are not only misrepresented, but pushed to the outermost forms of separation, debasement in our educational systems, from elementary, primary, public school, all the way to tertiary education, university. remains central. The Black Nova Scotian filmmaker Sylvia Hamilton's really still important little film, Little Black Schoolhouse, is a touchstone for folks who are interested in this to turn to. But I want to turn to three works that I think really get at the point that your question raises. The African American scholar and critic Saidiya Hartman, over 20 years ago, wrote a book called The Scenes of Subjection, in which Hartman argues that emancipation in the context of the USA was simply slavery by another name. And in that work, Saidiya Hartman demonstrates time and time again how US juridical practices continue slavery by limiting the ways in which Black people post-emancipation could build new lives. The African-American critic who's now a professor at York University in Ontario, Christina Sharp, in her book from 2016, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, lays out how the ongoing legacy of slavery produces some fundamental ways of continually reproducing death for Black people, including the ways in which Black women's very wombs are constructed within American popular culture and elsewhere as death, that Black women are giving birth to children that will be eaten up by a death machine, that these are the legacies of slavery. The Black Canadian novelist and poet Dionne Brand, in her wonderful and amazing book, The Map to the Door of No Return, takes up these same questions and concerns, a book written about 20 years ago. And Dionne takes us across not just North America, back into the Caribbean, all the way to Trinidad, where she was born, to raise the question of how the legacy of slavery by another name, the prohibition of freedom for Black people, continues to shape our lives. And just this year in 2021, I published two very long essays, a book called The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Black Freedom, and another book on property. And in both of those works, I argue that emancipation often gets confused with freedom, that they're not the same thing, that the juridical legislative nature of emancipation is not the same thing as freedom. That when emancipation occurred and Black people walked off the plantations, and this argument is very much in service of Saidiya Hartman's argument, that the imperial powers, the enslaving powers found ways to hold Black people in servitude. They brought in vacancy laws. They brought in indentured laborers. They found all kinds of ways. In the US, they brought in sharecropping. They found all kinds of ways to hold us and tie us to the ongoing practices of enslavement by other names. They lynched us, they murdered us. And the legacy of all of that is today experiencing what we call systemic racism, in what we call the over-policing of our communities, in what we call maternal deaths. Black women giving birth in North America are dying in such great proportions in terms of other women, in the ways in which our kids are turfed out of schools and what we call the school to prison pipeline. All of this is the legacy of enslavement. All of this is the prohibition of Black people being able to fully free themselves. But I go one step further and I say that even in the post-colonial states in Africa and the Anglophone Caribbean, but elsewhere as well, that the global relations also keep us from being able to articulate fully what freedom might mean for us. We are pushed and forced and cajoled into systems that we might want to change, that we might want to make different. And we see this today much clearly and with such dreadful sadness in our beloved Haiti and in Cuba, where US imperialism is fermenting after 60 years of a deadly, vicious blockade in Cuba, which is not to say that Cubans might not have legitimate issues with their own nation. But the violence of the blockade has produced some really deadly effects for Black people in Cuba and other Cubans. And similarly in Haiti, ongoing, continuous occupation, support of dictatorships, of brutal regimes have emaciated and dismembered that nation state. So the legacies of transatlantic slavery are everywhere. On the African continent, the death of millions of people have really significantly impacted those economies and nation states that come out of European colonization there too. So it is not enough to say that we are actually behind slavery. The real issue here is that all of the practices and forces that made slavery possible continue to underwrite the societies that we live in globally.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Walcott. I recall when I read the Abolition Act, and as you have said, emancipation doesn't mean freedom. The only people who were actually free were children under 6. Everyone else was moved into the apprenticeship. And what are children under 6 going to do without their parents and older siblings? So by design, the system always found a way to keep Black people from that actual freedom. So thank you so much for raising that. Dr. Davidson.
Yeah, and my apologies, Siddiqui. You were the one who brought up Sam Sharp earlier, and I incorrectly credited to Diane.
I corrected you.
Yes, thanks. Let me continue, because with where Dr. Walcott left off, because my comments as I thought about it, it relates to this notion of disciplining Black bodies, that there is a way in which slavery was just simply one mechanism for the exploitation of Black labor, and the sort of capturing of Black life in ways that will undervalue it, because the modern world is constructed in such a way as to require a permanent underclass in order to keep things going. And certainly the comments that the Diane made about the universal nature of slavery, and then the time comes when the ideal slave gets fused in consciousness and practice with an African, is an important step for us in understanding this. In other words, in the hierarchy and constructions of race in the modern world, Black life was placed at the bottom of that hierarchy. And no matter what you do, and no matter how the society changes and evolves, the devaluation of Black life persists. And what changes are the mechanisms for sustaining that devaluation. Mm-hmm. And so at the heart of our modern world is the exploitation and belief that here is a group of people that are both exploitable and deserve exploitation. And so it is, I found it surprising at first, and I'm no longer surprised by these things, but some people will find it quite surprising that quite a number of people who were in the forefront of the abolitionist movement were deeply racist. Because here were people who recognized slavery was wrong. The kinds of ways in which that system worked was wrong. And it was wrong for white people to do it because it reflected badly upon us them as a race. But that did not mean that they felt that Black people were equal. So you had a lot of racist ideas and stuff. I mean, yeah, paternalism is racist. And we see some of that persists. So what happens is we have come to the point in our lives, certainly in certain parts of the world, where we think that certain types of actions, certain types of behaviors are coded very clearly as as either racist or problematic, and then we get distracted and can't see the complete edifice that has been constructed in order to sustain and maintain these racial hierarchies and the exploitation of Black life. So we get distracted by the kinds of words people say or don't use, or we get distracted with a lot of narratives about the inconveniences that Black bourgeois individuals have in moving around the world, as those are the main problems. But the issue is the continued, which Dr. Walcott is referencing, the maintenance of a large Black underclass that marks several parts of the world, wherever you go, and the comfort that most people in the world, regardless of their race, have with the fact that that Black underclass should persist, and can only pay attention to it in ways in terms of trying to figure out how to hide it from view, or in other words, how to maintain and control it with more stringent disciplinary techniques. So these legacies are important. This is the issues around education and housing and all of these types of things. And they will persist because what you have is a structure that says to white people, maintain their privilege, even though what they will try to do more and more is to ease the burdens on the Black underclass. But those burdens can only be eased as long as white privileges are undisturbed. And I think it's an important set of windows for us to start to look at these legacies that remain in place and keep us thinking in these very structured ways. And I would keep arguing, in some ways, removing and reducing the capacity for kinds of resistance and revolutions that can take place.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Davidson. That was definitely insightful. Diane, you want to jump in?
Wow, I don't know where to jump in. I mean, Steve seems to have said it all. The point that I probably can add here is that because slavery and racism became so interlocked, the legacies are real and they're difficult to get rid of. And so legislations, proclamations, acts of parliaments, they might change the systems and they might change institutions, but they will not change attitude. So you can't legislate somebody to think that Blacks and whites are the same. And so if we have this very, very long tradition of whites being the owners of Blacks and white people who are owners of your labor, and then you are not regarded as human, you're regarded as chattel, you're regarded as property. Perhaps when slavery has been legislated out of existence, you might accept that these people are no longer slaves. You might not necessarily accept that they're still not Blacks, and that inherently the features that you associated with Blackness will remain. And so it's difficult for people to accept that Blacks are capable of thinking in the same way that other people can. And some of the justifications that were used to enslave people. For example, because they're inferior, they can't think like you. Because they're inhuman, they're not people, we can have them do anything. Yet these same slaves, these Black slaves, and let me say women in particular, they acted as wet nurses for the children of white women. And so if they were not human beings, why not give the children to a cow or a goat? Follow? So the arguments that were used to justify slavery were just illogical, they made no sense, and they were contradictory. But it doesn't mean that coming out of slavery, the thinking will be very different. And so Black people still are marginalized. Black people still have to fight for some type of equality, and persons can say there's no such thing as equality. So Steve make mention of that. So there is always going to be the situation where the Blacks are an underclass. And even in the Caribbean, where we have the Black populace is larger than the whites, they are not necessarily the ones who are the drivers and the movers and the shakers. Yes, they have been educated because of the nature of the society, but the point is Blacks everywhere and anywhere are still the underclass, as Steve said. The thing with the more developed societies where slavery existed is that they have seen it necessary to sort of have these riders or these things that, for example, if you're applying for a job or if you're applying to go to university, there has to be this statement that this is a type of university where they don't discriminate on the basis of age and sex and race and blah, 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 blah. Because if that's not said, Blacks might not necessarily get a fair chance or an opportunity to do the things that other persons, the whites in the society will. So basically, the legacy, I'm not quite sure what really will cause a change, except a real change in mindsets.
And just to continue with that, some of those things that continue to show the realities of Black people today having to deal with the legacies of slavery. First and foremost, if you have to dichotomize history, they come in and do what they did to dehumanize African people, buying them like commodity. And after that, they go on a campaign of colonizing lands. Colonialism and neo-colonialism are still legacies of slavery. And when they colonize lands, for example, they came from Europe and took over the lands of the indigenous people of this country we now call Canada. And then they put a legal system that is not indigenous, a legal system that does not belong to the people of the land which they colonized. Up to this day, we have the legacy of colonialism because they are using a different legal system. The rules that they themselves have set and put in place and require you to follow them to the letter. Remember, it was an indigenous land, guided by indigenous practice, guided by indigenous rules, but they have brought their own system.
Right, yes.
Furthermore, come to the issue of immigration. I think it was Renato who said in another gathering, not here, that when we Africans have to travel, we have to have a bulk of documents to prove our identity. You have to have a bulk of documents if you are traveling, okay, before COVID. If you're traveling to any part of the world, you have to have a bulk of documents to prove your identity. If you come to many immigration points, you face a sets of questions. You'll be going to the same conference, same gathering with a white Caucasian person who will be just told, welcome, madam, or welcome, sir. And for you, my friend, they'll ask you, so what is your mission here? No, I'm coming to attend a conference. Where is the letter of invitation? Do you have money? They'll ask you all sorts of questions that they have not asked to the other Caucasian person. Discrimination, but also a legacy of slavery. Look at immigration itself and the immigration law. For those who have migrated from other countries to come and live in a country called Canada. First of all, they came and colonized us and taught us English. So we have done English from kindergarten up to university. So I did my degrees in English, up to my PhD in English. But when I'm applying for my permanent resident status, they say I've got to do an English test. So you've got to go and do an English test, basic English, which if they gave to any Canadian, they may not even go through that exam. That's a legacy for me of controlling who comes in and who goes out. In this country, they have colonized, which was not initially theirs. So the legal system, the immigration system, employment discrimination. I have a relative of my wife who's a medical doctor, having trained in Africa, but also in Germany. And she comes here and they have to subject her to the whole process as if she's not a practicing doctor. She challenges the system and says, but no, give me an exam and I'll show you I can do it. Doubting in terms of employment discrimination and the qualifications and degrees that people have, but also the other legacy of over-incarceration. Over-incarceration, those of us who have Black youth, children, Black kids, we always have to tell them what to do and what not to do when working in the street, when going in that shop. Make sure you don't put your hoodie on the head. Make sure you don't put your hands in the pocket. Why are we doing all these things? Because there's a legacy that says the system will be unfair to you because of your skin color. The system will be unfair to you because you're a Black kid, whether you like it or not. And so those are some of the legacies that I see: immigration challenges, travel issues, the legal system, employment discrimination, but also over-incarceration, just like the statistics that you mentioned at the beginning, Sadiki, the number of Blacks that are being incarcerated on petty crimes. And look at the judgments when these lawyers are dealing with this legal system. Black person will get 10 years and the white guy will get 3 months. And they can come out after 1 month.
Thank you so much, everyone. I recall quite recently that Queen's University repealed and apologized for a policy they had in place from 1980 that prevented Black medical students from entering, and specifically not just any Black students, but Black students from the British Isles. And it is just in 2019 that they repealed that particular policy in their system. I also recall growing up and hearing this little song: if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're yellow, you are mellow. And if you're Black, stay in the back. Those who have fought enslavement, they cleared a path for us, but we acknowledge that slavery is the legacies, the systemic racism is so deeply embedded in the fabric of society, as you all have said quite aptly. Can you see a way out for us to continue the work of the freedom seekers for justice and equity? What can a regular person do in light of all of these potential challenges? And I'll start. I'm going to invite Dr. Steed Davidson to start.
Well, among the things that can be done is on days like this, for the type of educational process that we're having here to occur. But people should, I think, the stories of the long struggle for freedom and those who fought it is something that should be placed front and center within Black communities. One of the challenges that we have is a kind of social amnesia, but we have a social amnesia that's built upon white mythologies, that's designed to encourage forgetting. And to the extent that we get absorbed into those white mythologies is the extent to which we forget the struggle and the long moments of the struggle. so I constantly say reference the Haitian Revolution, primarily as a counter narrative. I saw recently where a journalist was interviewing someone and she says, well, you know, we have to say this, Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. This is a collusion of the Western media to constantly drum in the minds of people to associate Haiti with poverty and to obscure all of the legacies of the struggle. And of course, to hide the vicious, violent acts of countries like France and the US in the underdevelopment of Haiti. So that you know, resisting those kinds of social amnesias is an important part of the struggle. Awareness. The other thing I would say is to avoid charity. Avoid charity as a gift on the path towards freedom. That is, you know, again, one of the issues around the white mythologies that we can see is the sense that white people have been generous. And so it's important for Black people, particularly Black people who live in countries like Canada and the US, not to succumb to the notion that, well, you're kind of here at the invitation and the benevolence of white people. And there's this enjoyment of the resources and the development that white people created. And this is a gift. Again, all of these notions are built upon misconceptions because, you know, we don't need to go into that. But this idea that within these national spaces is this act of generosity. And therefore, we should be thankful, even though when you look around and you make clear and critical observations, what you're being thankful for are crumbs and morsels. And then, you know, a third thing I would say is on a day like this, you know, I mean, another one of the sort of legacies I'll try to invoke is that of Marcus Garvey. And Garvey's notion of his up you mighty race idea is this push against internalized oppression. And there's some problems with the way Garvey kind of conceptualized parts of that, and even his, you know, sort of association with Booker T. Washington. Some of that is problematic. But this push against the internalized oppression is an important thing for us to capture. Because a lot of times we tell ourselves we don't deserve a whole lot more than we actually are, and fail to see the inherent dignity of people of African descent. Now, I'm not into the, well, we were all kings and queens in Africa kind of a thing. That's not what I'm talking about, because it was the kings and queens in Africa that created the problems, that helped to facilitate the problems. So that's not a good space to inhabit, and all of us can be kings and queens. And if you have a monarchical system, means that you have people who are serving that. Again, not a very good model, and I would hope Black people would stop using it. But because you do not have to be a queen or a king to be a human with dignity. Regardless of your state, you deserve dignity. And if we could claim that, claim it, regardless of who we are, what we have done, what we have gone through, that, you know, those are some of the things I would encourage us to think about.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Steed. Japhet?
Transformation comes through knowledge. And so let us use all available educational spaces to learn, to exercise critical thinking, to work towards that collective humanity which my people from Southern Africa have called Ubuntu. Umuntu ngobantu ngomuntu. We are human because of our collective humanity. And so let us focus and work towards whatever that which promotes peace, whatever that which promotes justice, whatever that which promotes dignity, but also unmasking all these legacies that still are around. Let us unmask them. Let us denounce them for what they are, and also liberate ourselves by really experiencing that genuine freedom as critical thinkers in whichever spaces that we are found to making a contribution to the entire agenda of life. Because all human beings deserve dignity, and all human beings deserve respect.
Thank you so much. Dr. Walcott?
Yes, I think I want to pick up on the thread that my colleagues have really begun to lay out here around the question of the human. You know, the great Jamaican thinker and scholar Sylvia Wynter has taught us that, you know, what Europe was able to accomplish after Columbus sailed and in the advent of the colonization of the Americas and the enslavement of Black people, of African people made into Black people and so on, was that Europe took its own, and this is the important word, its own partial view of what it meant to be human and imposed that on all of us. And they imposed it on all of us through violence, through all forms of inculcation, all forms of coercion that we still live with today. So many of us are striving to be a particular kind of human in the world that we can only fail at because we can't become white. We can't become European. So we keep failing at it. And that failure brings with it and has many consequences for us individually and collectively. So even within the context of slavery, right, there was this notion that the slave who ran away from their abuse, from the brutality, from the terror, from the overwork, from the living towards death immediately, almost immediately, was somehow mentally ill. Drapetomania was the invented invented to mark that. And even now, when Black people explain to other people the experiences that we have with racism, our explanation of the world that we live in seems alien to other people. They say, oh, that can't be true. You can't actually be experiencing what you're telling me. So Black people are asked to live in a world where so much of the world is actually launched against their own experiences, launched against what it is that we live day in and day out. So not to be too abstract, but one of the things that we're grappling here with is what actually does personhood mean? And what kind of world can we build in which our individual and collective personhoods are valued and can come into a different kind of unity, a different kind of relation? Because the world that we have now at this moment as we speak is not one in which we can come into a kind of mutual cohabitation, a mutual care for each other, because we are working from that partial view that Europe has constructed for us of what it means to be human. A human that is entirely only constructed from the perspective of Europeanness. And because of that, every other way of being human, whether it's African, it's Black, it's Indigenous, Asian, and so on, is seen as a kind of lesser form of humanness, if not sometimes exactly entirely outside the category of human. And that's so the transformation that we need is not just only in terms of access to resources and so on. It's an entire transformation in terms of what it means to live a life and what it means to live a life in relation to others. And that is something that requires not only active resistance, not only the kinds of upheavals that we see momentarily that happen within slavery and happen now as that we call riots and other kinds of things, but it's really a transformation of our entire consciousness. And a different, as Sylvia Wynter would say to us, we need now to establish new forms of human life, new ways of living together, new ways of mutually co-constituting each other, new ways of caring for each other.
Mm. Thank you so much, Professor Walcott. I'll just remind people or listeners and watchers that if you have any questions, now is the time to throw it into the chat as I invite Dr. McCollum to close this particular section.
Okay, a number of things have come to mind. I'm picking up on Steve's use of the term social amnesia. And as he said that, I also thought about Black mentality, because in a sense, some of the legacies have to do with how Blacks have internalized the views of them. And, you know, until we can get to a stage where we stop internalize it, and as a matter of fact, sometimes Blacks themselves, they seem like collaborators. And if you think of the days of slavery when the slave masters used Blacks as slave drivers, it was a part of the collaboration because they tended to be harder on their own kin than would a white slave driver. So Blacks themselves have a mentality that they need to re-examine. They also need to open themselves up to not only questioning the system that they have inherited and the system that they're living in, but to be a little more proactive and to develop some agency in terms of fighting back, not physically fighting, but fighting back, so that, you know, we can sort of get to a place where there can be some dialogue with respect to how Blacks are treated. I think education might be, people might think that, yes, it's overstated, but, you know, if we don't have the right people writing the curriculum, if we don't have the right people writing the textbooks, and if we don't have historians who live up to the expectations of them, because historians are really the ones who are the culture carriers, they're the ones who are to help to inform the masses. And if they don't live up to the job of putting down on paper some things about the unpleasant those aspects of the past that are not so nice, if we don't get a balance. So in the case of Canada, if we don't get to a place where we can be comfortable with the negative aspect of the past, the fact that slavery existed and that we were culpable and we were involved in it, people will continue to be blind to it, and people will continue to be surprised by discussion that indicate that, yes, even though we were seen as a place where fugitives could come, and even though it's a multicultural society, and so all color, all creed, all races are treated as one, basically, that's the theory, until we get to a place where they can see for themselves that what is said in theory is not actually what is happening in practice. Perhaps we will have a problem on our hand in terms of getting to the point where we pick up from where the freedom fighters left off, right? So the curriculum, I think, is important. The type of textbooks that are written for students to learn about the past and to learn about every aspect, all of the unpleasantness, but also some of the good things, so that they can come away with an understanding that, yes, we're not perfect, nobody's perfect. So when things happen, like the case now with all of the graves which are being found and so on, no one should be shocked and surprised and feel bad about it because they say, yes, we know that this used to happen. Now we're hearing that there are more of them, that sort of thing. So I think that is where I think we need to go.
Thank you so much. I think we've had a very detailed discussion and you've raised so many important issues. And I hope that the listeners have taken note of some of the areas that they would like to continue their reading. Last words. I invite you to share any last words with us. We continue this justice work for a just and equitable society. Any words of encouragement?
My thought, let me just begin first. I think that the way to go is to accept some of the wrongs of the past and to use that as a springboard to move on. So the fact that Emancipation Day is tabled as a day to be recognized as an event that happened at a particular point in time, I think that's the beginning of the process, so that more and more persons can now learn why are Canadians celebrating Emancipation Day if in fact slavery had not existed. So it might begin the discussion, curriculum might be revised, parents might want their children to be learning more about their past and not just a nice part of the past. And so I think it will give us a more realistic, it's more realistic for us to proceed when we acknowledge the wrongs and we acknowledge the negatives, so that we can see what we can learn from it and to understand what is going on now and how it might be, those things might be corrected. So I believe this is a step in the right direction.
If I may, when Marie Joseph Angelique burned down what is now called Old Montreal in an attempt to free herself from an abusive master, and her punishment was to be quartered and burned and dragged through the streets of Montreal. That's a story that should be a part of the everyday lexicon of what we now call Canada.
Yeah.
A full Cooper's rendering of that story in the hanging of Angelique is really important. There are many other stories of how slavery has impacted and shaped what we call Canada that is so crucial for people who call themselves Canadians to be dealing with. You know, the deep sense of not just denial, but repression of slavery in Canada makes the ideal notion of multiculturalism that much more difficult to achieve.
Yes.
That you can't actually come to terms with and reckon with being a multicultural society when the kinds of histories that have shaped who you are so fundamentally denied. And when people are inducted into that denial. So it's not just that they're denied, but as newer people enter this territory in this space, they're inducted into that denial. So there's a fundamental, you know, there is much to be, there's much notable about this moment in Canadian time and space where Emancipation Day has been now accorded this official status. But again, for those of us from Ontario, you know, we unofficially celebrated Emancipation Day every August 1st with Caribana. That thing that we call Carnival, Caribbean Carnival, was really a celebration of Emancipation Day. It's not accidental that it happened on the August 1st weekend. And so for many of us, the life, the immediacy of what Emancipation Day meant is not new. And this declaration doesn't make it new. But what it should account for, what it should begin to do, is to offer many other Canadians a particular kind of historical and contemporary reckoning. So that it's not simply that Black people who might be immigrants or migrants to this space find themselves excluded, suffering over police. That's happening because there's a longer, deeper history of Black people in this place that this place has never reckoned with. And that denial of that history now meets those people, right? The Black Nova Scotian who is 5th, 6th, and 7th generation, the Black person from Chatham, from Grey County, who's 5th and 6th generation, they know this. They have lived that denial day in, day out, generation after generation. So this is not simply a question of the recent Black person into the territory called Canada. This is a much longer, deeper
Mhm.
history.
Mhm.
And if we can't confront that much longer, deeper history of denial and repression, we can't actually begin to fundamentally deal with what is right in front of us today. And I think that's really what's at stake.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would like to say that slavery was not a choice, but opting to ignore its legacy is a choice.
Mhm.
And therefore, when we talk about this ideology of ensuring the domination of one group over another, this ideology continues to negatively impact whether it's civil or political or economic, social or cultural rights of people of African descent. And so I think the duty to continue to tell the story, tell the story and tell it as it is.
Mhm.
Okay. Continue to tell the story, because like we have experienced, some of us in our educational spaces, there are still those aha moments where people suddenly say, is that so? I didn't know Canada was. I thought we were the kindest of people in the world. So we should continue telling the story and tell it as it is, because slavery was not a choice, but opting to ignore its legacy is a
A
choice.
choice, right.
Thank you.
So thank you for this education, my friends, particularly on some of the deeper realities within Canada. I want to, say add to some of what you've already said. The idea of thinking through or coming to this realization of Canada as a settler colony of the British Empire, and the ways in which that settler colony benefited and continues to benefit from, Lisa Lowe likes to talk about this thing of the intimacies of the four continents, so that you can't divorce a settler colony from Canada, even if it wants to claim its innocence from the trickle-down benefits of slavery and the way in which slavery was tied into what's going on in India and other parts of Asia and the Americas as well. So there's no innocence there, even if the Canadians might want to say it didn't happen on our territory. The products, the values, the benefits came to Canada as well. But in closing, I also want to be mindful that we're having this conversation within the context of church, and to kind of press a little further something that you referenced, Siddiqui, at the start. The story of how a sort of a Black Atlantic link religiously is an important one I also like to make, of thinking through the Haitian Revolution, when Christianity, of course, distanced itself from the plight of the enslaved. And what happened instead certainly was how these enslaved persons found themselves deep within the religious milieu of an African religion, namely Voodoo, to inspire a sense of fight for freedom in, say, Savannah, Georgia, where people like George Lyle and David George stood on the side of what they thought would have been the winning side, because they were standing on the side they thought would give them freedom, i.e. the British forces. And in doing so, one of the things that happened to them was, well, George Lyle ended up being deported to Jamaica, and David George went to Nova Scotia, and then on from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, creating religiously this pathway of a Black Atlantic religious freedom movement. And this is an important thing for us within the life of the church, where too often, I think, modern day Christianity has taken on this very pacifist, this sort of a sedentary kind of a posture, and not a fierce advocate on the side of freedom, and particularly on the side of of freedom for Black life, an important historical trajectory and an important point for us to emphasize that will call the church to account for its complicity over the years, historical complicity, but also for its continued silence today and its continued apathy today to the plight of a Black underclass and the plight of people whose bodies are being violently abused in various ways. And the church stands by and allow it to happen. And in silence, just somehow thinking that as long as we get your souls, we're good. And that's all that God wants us to be interested in. So on a day like today, where the issues are about freedom, not in a spiritualized way, but it's about freedom in terms of what happens to the material conditions under which we live, we also need to pull the mission of the church within to this conversation. But that will take us a little longer, and we'll have to pick that up another time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insights. I want to thank Dr. Diane McCollum, Reverend Dr. Jaffet, Professor Rinaldo Walcott, Dr. Steve Davidson, for sharing your wisdom with us today. My takeaways: the journey of people of African descent have been filled with hurdles, and we are called to resist the social amnesia, to raise consciousness and keep reminding people of the story. We are called to highlight the myths and legacies of enslavement. But we're also challenged, and I heard you clearly, to resist the rhetoric of charity that serves to reinforce white privilege. We're called to push against the internalized oppression and claim our dignity, where we encourage people to educate themselves, to unmask and denounce the legacies that exist of slavery. But we, as Black people, people of African descent, are also called upon to liberate ourselves. We have been doing it for a long time. And it is just to capture that spirit again and continue to do this work. I was really struck by Professor Walcott's comment about affirming the individual and collective humanity and personhood of every person, because that is the fundamental issue for us, isn't it? That original sin of distorting the capacity and the personhood of the person with the Black skin. We are called, and what we're striving for is not just to complain, but what we are looking for is relational healing. I want to acknowledge the heroes and the sheroes who have sacrificed themselves in resistance to enslavement, and for those who continue the work of achieving full freedom. It is on their shoulders that we stand. If you are interested in further reading on emancipation and anti-Black racism for Canada, the First United Church in Fort Saskatchewan, under the leadership of the Reverend Dr. Douglas Walfall, they published a book of reflections from diverse voices on this issue, including some of our guests here today, the Rinaldo Walcott, Dr. Steve Davidson. Three of our moderators are also offered their voice to the discussion: Althea Spencer Miller and Anthony Reddy. I also want to say thank you, not just to our panelists, but to Bob Filler, who is the technical support, and to Reverend Dr. Paul, who made this initiative possible. And I want to thank you for listening. Happy Emancipation Day, everyone. And may this day be a day of reflection and concern and commitment to justice and equity on behalf of people from African descent. Every blessing to you. And thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are we
Thank you.
to, is Will Paul be coming to speak with us? Or we leave now?
Maybe we should leave
Yep.
and come back.
Because he said that he'll come back.
Oh, there is Trinity United Church hosting.
Very much.
Welcome back, Bob.
Thank you.
Everything was working, so I just kind of stayed out of the way.
Will Paul be coming back? Or we leave now?
Here comes Paul.